So imagine walking into your boss's office tomorrow morning.
Okay.
You sit down, you slide a spreadsheet across the desk, and you prove unequivocally that you're producing like almost 8 times more value for the company today than you did a few years ago.
Right. You're faster, you're more efficient, you are just generating massive amounts of wealth.
Exactly. And in response, your boss looks at the data, nods, and slides back a raise of less than 1%.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, you'd probably quit on the spot, right? You would think it was a joke.
You'd have to.
Well, according to, honestly, the most striking piece of economic data from the last century, that isn't a hypothetical scenario at all. That is the exact mathematical reality of the modern American worker.
Yeah, it's the ultimate cold shower for anyone who thinks working harder automatically guarantees a better life. We are essentially looking at a crime scene today, and I mean, the victim is the purchasing power of the working class.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to this deep dive. Today we are bypassing all the nostalgic, feel-good tropes about, how things used to be.
Right, no rosy glasses here.
Exactly. We are not dealing in anecdotes about your grandfather buying a house on a single income. Instead, we are looking at one specific, strictly data-driven source. It's a chart mapping the trajectory of the United States economy from 1948 to 2014.
And the mission of this deep dive is to really investigate a massive structural divergence.
Yeah. We are treating this like a murder mystery, where we have the victim, we have the exact time the incident occurred, and we are going to track down the mechanism of the weapon used. If you, the listener, have ever felt like you are running on a treadmill that just keeps speeding up while your paycheck barely moves,
Yeah.
this data reveals the systemic architecture of that exact feeling.
Yeah, and to understand the crime, you really have to understand what the neighborhood looked like before the incident, right? You have to establish the baseline of how the U.S. economic system functioned before the treadmill broke. The chart is, it's a simple graph with 2 lines. The vertical axis measures cumulative percent change, starting at 0, and the horizontal axis just marches forward through time.
So let's focus entirely on the first era mapped out here. That's 1948 to 1973.
Right, the post-war era, what some economists actually call the golden age of capitalism.
And looking at the data, golden age almost sounds like an understatement, honestly.
It really does.
What we see here is near-perfect mathematical symmetry. Over this 25-year stretch, net productivity grew by 96.7%, and hourly compensation, that grew by 91.3%.
The 2 lines are virtually overlapping on the graph.
Yeah, it's wild. But before we get too deep into the numbers, we really need to define our terms here, because the footnotes on this chart are crucial to understanding the gravity of what we're looking at. So what exactly is hourly compensation in this context?
Well, the source is very precise here. Hourly compensation specifically tracks production and non-supervisory workers in the private sector.
Meaning, we are completely excluding the C-suite.
Exactly.
We are not looking at the CEO's stock options or like the regional vice president's massive year-end bonus.
Precisely. We are measuring the vast majority of the workforce, the people physically manufacturing the goods, operating the logistics networks, providing the services, writing the code. This is the everyday worker's baseline pay.
Got it. And the second line, the one labeled net productivity.
So the footnote defines this as the growth of output of goods and services of the total economy, but with a really critical caveat. It's minus depreciation per hour worked.
Minus depreciation. Let's pause on minus depreciation for a second, because that feels like a vital technical distinction.
Yeah.
Why does subtracting depreciation actually matter?
Because it proves the growth is real human-driven value, not just some temporary accounting illusion.
Oh, interesting. Give me an example.
Well, let's say a factory buys a $1 million robotic arm to speed up the assembly line. That robot degrades over time, right?
Yeah.
It has wear and tear.
Right. It eventually breaks down.
Exactly. If economists didn't subtract the cost of that degradation, the company's productivity would look artificially massive. So by subtracting depreciation, this chart is measuring the true net value added to the economy by human labor and efficient management.
Okay, so when I look at the 1948 to 1973 era, an inch of actual net value equated to basically an inch of compensation.
Right.
You gave 96.7% more output, you received 91.3% more pay.
Exactly.
I need to stop you there and push back on this narrative a bit. Are we romanticizing this era?
How do you mean?
Because it is really easy to look at those overlapping lines and call it a golden age of shared prosperity. But I mean, we are talking about a post-World War II boom,
Yeah.
where the United States basically had zero global manufacturing competition. Europe and Japan were literally rebuilding from rubble.
That's a very fair point.
Right. So isn't it entirely possible these two lines were glued together purely by a historical geopolitical anomaly and not by some fundamental economic fairness?
Yeah, and this raises an important question. Was the symmetry just a fragile coincidence, or was it anchored by the rules of the monetary system itself?
Okay, go on.
The structural skeptics, right, the economists who analyze the deep plumbing of our financial system, they point out that this era was fundamentally anchored by the Bretton Woods system.
Right.
Specifically, the US dollar was tied to a physical asset. It was tied to gold.
Which brings us to the visual center of our source material.
Yeah.
And literally the scene of the crime. Because the chart does not show a gradual drifting apart of these lines.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't look like a natural evolution of a globalizing economy at all. It explicitly flags a single, violent, structural catalyst. There is a bright red arrow stamped right in the middle of the graph, pointing to the year 1971.
Yeah.
And the text says, 1971, Nixon removes the gold standard. But here's where it gets really interesting. How does an abstract monetary policy shift, like a president going on television and taking the dollar off gold, physically sever the link between a worker's labor and their paycheck?
That is the trillion-dollar question right there. And to answer it, we have to understand what fiat currency actually is. When President Nixon enacted what became known as the Nixon shock, the currency was no longer pegged to a finite physical asset.
Right.
Money became fiat, meaning its value was dictated entirely by government decree and central bank policy.
So the government could suddenly just expand the money supply without needing to dig up more gold to back it up.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Imagine productivity and wages are being measured by a wooden ruler. For 25 years, the ruler is made of solid wood, representing a currency anchored by gold.
Okay, I follow.
An inch of physical work equals an inch of pay. Everyone agrees on the measurement because the ruler cannot change size. But in 1971, that wooden ruler is swapped out for a ruler made of an elastic band.
Oh, wow.
That is fiat currency. The worker is still producing the exact same physical effort, but the institution measuring that effort can now stretch the elastic.
So the company measures its profit with the stretched inch, but pays the worker with the contracted one.
That is precisely the mechanism. When you remove the gold standard, you allow for rapid expansion of the money supply, what we often call cheap money.
Right.
But here is the critical aha moment regarding how this impacts wages. When new money enters the economy, it doesn't just magically appear in everyone's bank account equally.
Obviously not.
It flows through the banking system and corporations first.
Okay, so this is the Cantillon effect.
Exactly, the Cantillon effect. The new cheap money flows into assets. It flows into the stock market, real estate, corporate valuations. This triggers asset inflation. The people who own those assets, the capital owners, see their wealth skyrocket. But wages are sticky.
Meaning they don't change daily or even monthly.
Right. Your salary is negotiated, once a year, maybe less.
Yeah, if you're lucky.
Exactly. By the time that newly printed, diluted money trickles down into the worker's paycheck, it has already lost its purchasing power due to the inflation it caused in the broader economy.
It acts as a stealth tax. The worker's physical output is still real. Like, they're still building cars, writing software, treating patients. But the monetary unit they are paid in is constantly degrading in value before it even reaches their wallet.
And that is the exact moment the divergence on the chart begins. The top line, representing the total output and asset valuations, keeps surging upward. The bottom line, representing the purchasing power of the hourly worker, effectively flatlines. The wooden ruler becomes an elastic band, and the tension just snaps.
Okay, let's look at the mathematical aftermath of that snap. We move into the era mapped from 1973 to 2014, the period where the divergence becomes the defining feature of the American economy. From 1973 to 2014, the total economy's net productivity continued to surge. It grew by another 72.2%.
The American workforce just kept getting drastically better, faster, and more technologically efficient.
But hourly compensation, in that same 41-year window, the pay for production and non-supervisory workers grew by a mere 9.2%.
It's staggering.
Okay, wait, let me just do the math in my head here. If output goes up 72% and pay only goes up 9%, that means productivity is growing roughly 7, maybe almost 8 times faster than pay. Am I reading that right?
You are. It is a 7.8x multiplier. For every 1% increase in the purchasing power of their paycheck, the worker was delivering nearly 8% more real value to the economy.
And I have to play the investigator here because energy in a closed system does not just vanish.
Right.
Wealth doesn't just evaporate into the ether. If the total economy's net productivity skyrocketed by 72%, but the millions of people physically doing the work only saw a 9% bump, where exactly did that massive surplus of wealth migrate? Who walked away with the missing value?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the chart reveals the suspects through its own parameters. Remember, who is excluded from the bottom line?
The supervisory workers, the executives, the shareholders, the owners of capital.
Yes. The shift to fiat currency didn't just cause inflation. It enabled a massive structural phenomenon known as financialization. Because money was cheap and detached from physical constraints, corporations realized they didn't actually need to reinvest their surplus profits back into the workforce to grow.
Right.
Instead, we saw the aggressive rise of shareholder primacy.
This is the era of stock buybacks.
Exactly. In the Golden Age, if a factory became 20% more efficient, the surplus was largely distributed through higher wages or reinvested into better equipment.
It went back into the real economy.
Post-1971, if a corporation became 20% more efficient, that surplus was captured by the top line. Executives, whose compensation became heavily tied to stock performance rather than operational health, used that surplus to buy back company stock, artificially inflating the share price.
Bro.
The wealth migrated directly from the factory floor to the financial portfolio. We call this capital capture.
But let me play devil's advocate for a second. Let's look at this through the lens of a globalized tech economy. If we had stayed on a rigid gold standard, constrained by the physical amount of yellow metal sitting in a vault, could we have possibly funded the internet boom?
It's a good question.
Could we have built the massive, complex global supply chains that basically define modern life? The dominant economic defense of 1971 is that the decoupling was a necessary evolution. We needed cheap money and flexible fiat to scale the world to where it is today.
That is the exact argument favored by proponents of modern monetary theory. They argue that the flexibility of fiat currency allowed for unprecedented global scale and technological innovation. And they aren't entirely wrong. I mean, it did fund the modern world. But the structural skeptics look at this chart and ask, at what cost?
Right. It scaled the economy, but it fundamentally rewired who captures the value of that scale.
Precisely. The argument is that we essentially mortgaged the working class's purchasing power to fund that technological boom. Yes, the pie got exponentially larger, but the mechanism for distributing the slices was intentionally broken.
Yeah.
The inflation inherent in the fiat system functioned as a vacuum, sucking the productivity gains upward into asset classes that the average wage earner simply doesn't own in significant enough quantities.
And when you look at the final data points on this chart, you see the staggering cumulative result of that decades-long vacuum. Let's look at the grand totals on the far right of the graph, ending in 2014.
Okay. By 2014, cumulative productivity had hit an astounding 238.7% increase since 1948.
238.7%, just an absolute rocket ship of human efficiency.
But cumulative compensation, it managed to reach just 109.0%.
Less than half.
Right, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, what this chart proves, unequivocally, is that the growth of total economic output has completely detached from the people producing the goods and services. The financialization of the economy means that capital now generates wealth independently of labor.
Which is wild to think about.
You don't need a perfectly symmetrical relationship with your workers anymore if your wealth is being generated by asset inflation, stock buybacks, and cheap debt.
So I guess the question is, what does this all mean? Let's summarize the journey we've just taken through this data. We started by looking at a baseline of mirrored growth, a 25-year era where the wooden ruler was intact. A 96% increase in productivity equaled a 91% increase in pay because the monetary system forced a physical relationship between output and reward.
Right.
Then we investigated the scene of the crime, the 1971 Nixon shock. The gold standard was removed, fiat currency was introduced, and the ruler became an elastic band.
And the mechanism of that crime was fiat-led inflation and capital capture. The new money flowed into assets, enriching capital owners, while the resulting inflation silently eroded the purchasing power of the sticky wages paid to the workers.
Leaving us with a decades-long reality where productivity grew nearly 8 times faster than compensation. The surplus wealth didn't vanish. It migrated upward into the financialized layer of the economy. I want to remind you, the listener, why this actually matters to your life today. We aren't just nerding out over economic history here.
No, not at all.
This chart is the foundational mathematics behind the modern cost of living crisis. It is the clinical, undeniable explanation for why it feels fundamentally harder to survive today than it did for your grandparents, even though you are armed with infinitely better technology and tools.
The rules of the machine were rewritten in 1971 to ensure that your increased effort no longer guarantees increased stability.
Exactly. Which brings me to one final, incredibly provocative thought. Because this chart ends in 2014, but we are living in the reality of what comes next. Look at the trajectory. The top line, productivity, is on an unstoppable upward path, hitting 238.7% and pointing toward the sky. And right now, we are staring down the barrel of an era defined by unprecedented technological automation.
Oh, absolutely.
We are talking about artificial intelligence, robotics, and generative algorithms that will multiply human output by factors we can barely comprehend.
It is going to cause a sudden, massive vertical spike in the productivity line.
So you have to ask yourself, if the pop line is about to go vertical, driven by AI that requires zero wages, what happens to the bottom line? Is it mathematically possible for your hourly compensation to ever catch back up? Or, as inflation continues to erode the fiat currency in your paycheck, will we see the day where the compensation line actually drops into the negatives? Something to think about the next time you step on the treadmill.